Okay, so my name's Charlotte Crofts. I'm from UWE, and we're joined by Professor Mulvey-Roberts, Marie Mulvey-Roberts, and Steve Hunt. Steve's going to be leading the tour, and Marie is going to be the voice of Angela Carter and also Susanna Clapp at one point. I don't know if Susanna Clapp is in the audience, but apologies in advance. I'm going to be kind of looking after the chat at the end when we come together for the kind of questions and answers and kind of discussion. And Marie's going to lead Steve in a conversation about his book, about her book, about Literary Bristol, and the importance that Bristol had in Angela Carter's development as a writer. And so I'm very excited. Just to warn you, we may have technical difficulties. And if we do, Steve's been very clever and had the foresight to record a version of the talk, which we can email to you via the attendees list later. So you won't miss out, but hopefully it'll all go fine. We've had a few internet problems and things like that. So please do bear with us. It kind of does feel a bit like year one in terms of technology sometimes. So I don't know if I can hand over to Steve now. He's going to introduce the fact that this is coming from Being Human Festival. It's part of a bigger thing. And then he's going to do the tour, and then we'll come back, all three of us, and do little question and answer sessions. So if you wait until the end to ask your questions in the chat, and I'll feed them in to Marie and Steve. So does that make sense? I hope that's okay. Marvelous. Okay, so Steve, over to you. Okay, just bear with me a moment when I get the tour up.
Can you hear me okay, everybody? Am I loud enough?
You're a little bit quiet, but yeah. I can hear you.
Okay, good. Yes, fine. Thanks very much. Great. Thank you.
Okay, so I think me and Marie will mute ourselves during Steve's talk so that we don't interfere and pop up on screen by mistake. Except, Marie, you need to not be mute when you do your things. So just don't talk when he's talking. I'll mute myself. Bye for now.
Can I, before you switch off, can I just have a quick check that people can hear me? I hope so.
Yeah, in the chat, they all say they can hear you, Steve.
Oh, fantastic. Right. Oh, good. Fantastic. Okay, welcome, everyone. So really pleased that you can join us. So this is part of the Being Human Festival. There's just a quick statement by Being Human that we'd like to read out to start with, and then we'll get started with the tour proper. So yeah, the tour is very much about identifying some of the connections between Angela Carter and Bristol. So Being Human is an event, a part of the National Being Human Fest of the Humanities, which is going on at the moment. So it started across the UK. It started on the 12th of November and it continues to the 22nd of November. So there's all sorts of other events like this, and obviously all online at the moment, so you can access those from wherever you are. It's the only national festival of the humanities in the UK. It's run by the School of Advanced Study at the University of London in participation with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. So most of the events are online this year, and you can, I expect most of you probably came through this route, but you can go and see the full programme online at www.beinghumanfestival.org. You can also follow the festival on at Being Human Fest on Twitter, Instagram, if you do Instagram, and Facebook. And there's a hashtag, which is hashtag Being Human 2020. And they're very keen to keep the festival events as far as possible free and improve the festival. And to help them do that, they're asking that you can take a moment to fill in their feedback survey at the end. And they say that feedback will be incredibly valuable to the organisers. They can put other events like this on. And finally, if you'd like to make a donation to the festival, you can go to the Being Human website and go to support us, and you'll be able to put that in. So thank you for that. So yeah, Being Human Festival this year is the overall theme is New World. So we're very much trying to keep in with that theme of New World. So we've called this particular tour of Angela Carter's 1960s we're going to call it we've used the idea of year one. So we're going to be talking about that in several ways. First of all, the author moved to Bristol in 1961. She said of the 1960s that truly it felt like year one when she was reflecting on the 60s 20 years later in the 1980s. And finally, we're going to be reflecting upon perhaps what we hope will be the post-pandemic year of 2021, and perhaps the potential for the already rather cliched idea of new normal to really mean something and to be something really transformational for the new year. So we're going to start the tour now, and then, as Charlotte mentioned, we're going to have a bit of a discussion and question and answer at the end. And yeah, we're very happy for you to put anything into the chat as we go through. So let's start our tour. So yeah, we're really delighted that you've joined.
Your screen yet, Steve? Sorry,
can you not see the screen?
No, I can't. So I think you need to share your screen.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought it was all going well.
No, it is going very well, but you haven't checked. Sorry to interrupt.
And I thought you could hear me and see me. Right. How about now?
Perfect. That's absolutely fabulous now.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, good. Right. Okay. So that was right. Okay. Fine.
Put the Being Human logo on.
Yeah. Yeah. There we go. So that was what you were supposed to be. That's what I thought you were looking at. Sorry. Okay. The wonders of technology. Right. Okay. So I'm hoping that you can see that one. So yeah, so we'll start the tour now. Anyway, so yeah, we're really glad and actually delighted that you come actually from all over the world. I could see several countries, maybe even several continents joining us as we started. That's really nice. So we're going to take a tour through the areas of Clifton and Hotwells in Bristol that Angela Carter would have known during the 1960s. So those of you that know Bristol, you can probably try and imagine these areas of Bristol as we go through. Others will. I'll try and describe it as we go through. But yeah, one hopefully not too distant day. We're really hoping that we can still go ahead and do a physical tour, and we can march around the area in a group as we intended to do originally. But it's nice in some ways that it's online, so that obviously means that many more people are able to join us. Yeah, and I'm sure that Angela Carter would have launched some really wonderful broadsides around the issue of coronavirus had she still been with us in 2020, which I think I'm right in saying would have been her 80th birthday this year if she'd been around. So yeah, what we're doing is we're taking the opportunity today to launch the Angela Carter map. So on the left of the screen there, you can see the guided tour of Angela Carter's 1960s Bristol, I hope. So that's the walking tour. That's been beautifully designed by my comrade Rich Grove of the Radical History Group. And yeah, I think we're already sharing the PDF of that. So if you've signed up for this, we're hoping that you've got access to the PDF and you can see the online copy of the map. And that's based on the Angela Carter's Provincial, Bohemia, the counterculture in 1960s, 1970s, Bristol and Bath, which you can see on the other side of the screen there as well. So that was published a bit earlier this year. So the idea of the map is that features 12 locations in Clifton and Hotwells in Bristol. So once you've got the map, you can either follow those from 1 through to 12, or obviously you can take a bit more of a pick and mix approach, and then you can visit some of the spots in your own time. I guess you could probably do this on Google Maps if you were in other parts of the world. And then we've also got a slightly more accessible route. So that involves missing the steps through Brandon Hill Park, I should say. And there's some quite steep hills in Bristol around Constitutional Hill and going up to Clifton. So Constitutional Hill is one of the steepest hills in Bristol. So you can avoid that in that way. But for those of you this afternoon, obviously this is online, so you can sit there in the comfort of your armchairs, I hope. And as it turns out, it's pouring down with rain here in Easton today, so that's probably just as well that we're not walking around the streets. And you can maybe have a drink of something suitable as we go through. What you might want to do is post in any 60s appropriate drinks, beverages, or tipples that you would have been drinking in the 1960s. I don't know, we were thinking earlier, maybe I was thinking of Watney's Pale Ale, that orange Piku tea that people used to drink. Definitely no cappuccinos or lattes. I think you'd have to have an instant coffee, or perhaps some of that coffee and chicory essence, camp essence that you used to have in the back of the cupboard in those days. Or maybe Corona Pop with the returnable bottles. So anyway, your suggestions for 1960s tipples would be great. So as we get underway on our tour, so let's just give you a little feel for what Bristol looked like, Clifton looked like in the 1960s. Bear with me, I'm hoping this is going to work. Right, okay, sorry to spring out of that quite abruptly, but I don't have any other way of moving that on. So not only is that Bristol during the 1960s, but that's very much Clifton. So that's Angela Carter's home territory when she was living there at that time. So we saw the Victoria Rooms in Bristol. We saw a bit of Birdcage Walk, and then right at the end, the guy that's climbing the steps and walking along, that's actually towards Royal York Crescent, where Angela Carter actually lived in the 1960s. So quite appropriate. So let's start on our tour. I suppose, first of all, we might want to just say a few words about who Angela Carter was. So, yeah, we would say she was one of the most critically acclaimed writers of the 20th century, and across the whole range of writing as well. So there's a Bristol-born novelist, Helen Simpson, described her as an uncategorizable genius. She was born as Angela Stalker in Eastbourne in 1940. Parents and Scottish and Yorkshire heritage. She was brought up in London, where she met her husband-to-be, Paul Carter. She was a journalist at that time already for the Croydon Reporter, and then she left that job, and the two newlyweds moved to Bristol in 1961, where Paul Carter was set up as an industrial chemist. They really met and bonded over their mutual interest in folk music, and they were both involved with the anti-nuclear movement as well. So that was a major social movement to develop after the Second World War, and to an extent it was a cultural movement as well. So it's not surprising when they moved to Bristol, then they sort of gravitated towards the folk scene here and the political circles when they tried to connect with their new neighbourhood in Clifton. So what did she make of this neighbourhood when she moved in to Bristol in 1961? And I think probably in many ways it was a little bit of a tough start. But they lived in this flat in Clifton for the rest of the 1960s, so nearly just under a decade. And I think what's really significant about that is it's where Angela Carter developed her really unique and brilliant voice as a writer. It was grounded in a really intriguing combination those of you are familiar with their writing, which I'm sure many of you are, but she's got that, to a certain extent, she was a real plain speaker, but then she's got this fabulous imagination, fascination for the surreal and the Gothic. So Bristol was great because there's plenty of surrealism and Gothicism in Bristol, so she was in the right place. Bristol can cater for those tastes, and also political convictions as well. So that was something that was also fitted her quite well here. And I'd say that the time and the place that she spent here really sort of sharpened those attributes. So she was made, and she was here in the 1960s. Obviously, that was a startling decade of change, and that was been reflected in the society and the urban environment that surrounded her here in Clifton and Hotwells area. So she wasn't one for false optimism, I'd say, and I love that, or positive thinking. I love the watchwords that are used in her final novel, Wise Children, quite a lot, where she says the two characters continually say, "Let's hope for the best, but expect the worst." But I think she always hoped and believed that for a better world could emerge from the blitzed Britain with its declining empire, and that she also developed the confidence that she herself could be a creative force in that process. So by the time she left Bristol, she'd actually written her first 5 novels, and also she was well on the way on that journey to writing some of those modern classics for which we say that she's such an acclaimed writer. So things like some of her most famous books, like The Bloody Chamber, short stories, Nights at the Circus, Wise Women. Wise Children, I should say, the final novel. So she was already on her journey as an important writer by the time she left Bristol, at a career that ended sadly with her untimely death from lung cancer in 1992. And I love this mural that you can see on the screen there. So there's my way of getting through the 2020 and some of the lockdowns. I've been going out for lots of exercises and walks, and I think the word is what we say is a coddywomple in Bristol. So that's when you go off wandering with no particular direction. So I was coming back from Sharhampton one day and I found this fabulous little, quite a big mural actually. This is the Cumberland. Those of you know Bristol. This is just next to Hotwells. This is the underpass at the Cumberland Basin. So you can see 7 women of Clifton and Hotwells there. And you've got Angela Carter on the right-hand side there. So this is the work of Amy Hutchins and Anna Haydock Wilson, who've created that mural of the 7 women of Bristol. And I think probably they're all in their own way. They were all about creating new worlds and looking at the potential of what a different future could be. So I think that's a lovely mural, and it also sort of indicates the growing recognition of the connection between Angela Carter and Bristol.
What I want is
Over to Marie as Angela Carter.
What I want is a voice, something personal and unmistakable that people will instantly recognize and say, "That's Ange."
Right, so thank you. So that was the significance of that music was the Blue Aeroplanes, a Bristol band, playing a song called Angela Carter. So yeah, this is a multimedia experience this afternoon. We've got all sorts of little images and films, and we've had the film, got some other music, and I've just put up on the screen there as well the first 3 Angela Carter novels. So those are ones that are usually known as the Bristol Trilogy, Shadow Dance 1966. Several Perceptions, published in 1968, and Love, which was published in 1971, but actually it was still written around about 1969 while she was still in Bristol. Okay. So let's start our tour then. So we're going to begin our tour today, the journey at the Royal West of England Academy. So that's that amazingly fantastic tiered building with the arched windows at the top of Queen's Road, or the bottom end of White Ladies Road in Bristol. So this is in Clifton. So in a way, I think for Angela Carter, this perhaps represents the road not travelled. So when she moved in Bristol, she'd already nurtured the idea that she could be a creative artist. But during the 1960s, she was still open to experimenting with various different media. So that was writing, but that was also painting as well. When she finished her degree at the University of Bristol, she enrolled in several evening classes to study art. And then she got as far as applying to become a full-time art student at the Royal West of England College of Art, which is was in the Royal West of England Academy at that time. So that's now moved over to the to UWE's University of West of England's Barashton campus. So she enrolled there in evening classes, but then when she wanted to become a full-time student, her application was unsuccessful. And they said she was not sufficiently single-minded about art, really her vocation. So whoever made that decision was possibly a little bit more insightful than she was about her direction. And I think we can probably be quite thankful for that rejection, in fact. But I think it's still really fitting that we start here, because half a century later, that was the place that hosted the first major exhibition of Angela Carter's in Bristol. And that was put on by our very own Marie Mulvey-Roberts and Fiona Robertson. It was really significant in making the case that Angela Carter was an important writer for us here in Bristol and in the West Country. So the exhibition was called Strange Worlds, The Vision of Angela Carter. It was launched in late 1916 and I believe went on into 2017, I should say. And it particularly celebrated her artwork that either influenced by Angela Carter's writings or was inspired by her own visually expressive style. So if you think about her novels and her short stories, there really are writings that paint pictures. And I think quite interesting, I was talking to one of Angela Carter's friends from this time, Chris Molan, recently, and Chris said that I thought it was an interesting comment. Angela was a woman who lived in many rooms. And I think Chris meant by that one of her circles was the world of folk music, but that she had lots of interests and groups of friends that were quite distinct from each other in Bristol and beyond. And I suppose the Strange Worlds exhibition was a glimpse into some of those rooms, the kinds of the worlds that were starting to live in Angela Carter's imagination. And some of the art there was those kind of gorgeous and crazy other realities conjured up. So there were artists like Marc Chagall there, Paul Arago, and there was also some surrealist artists appeared as well, such as Leonora Carrington. So I think that we're thinking about Angela Carter's ability to sort of conjure up a new world. The surrealist influence was a really big inspiration for that. So that's significant. And she wrote an essay about surrealism, which maybe Angela would like to tell us about.
Surrealism celebrated wonder, the capacity for seeing the world as if for the first time, which in its purest state is the prerogative of children and madmen. But more than that, it celebrated wonder itself as an essential means of perception, A premonition of the imminent end of the world is always a shot in the arm for the arts. If the world has in fact just ended, what then? The 1914-18 war was, in many respects, for France and Germany, indeed the end of the world. The Zurich Dada celebrated the end of the world and of art with it. However, the Russian Revolution of 1917 suggested the end of one world might mark the commencement of another world, one in which human beings themselves might take possession not only of their own lives, but also of their own means of expressing the reality of that life, i.e. art. It is possible for the true optimist to view the end of the world with sang-froid. What is so great about all this crap? Might there be something better? Surrealism's undercurrent of joy, of delight, springs from its faith in humankind's ability to recreate itself, the conviction that struggle can bring something better.
Deciding on where to go. Meet me under the wheel in the Natural History Museum. I think that's what she said. A little sad having to go there. Yawning in the sun. Like a child.
Okay, so you may have guessed that we're going to the museum now. So we're going to double back along Queen's Road towards the city centre. Then there's a magnificent building, and I love the fact that it's supposedly based on the Doge's palace in Venice, and so that's the original museum. And I can remember that being the University Refectory when I used to work in Bristol in the late 1980s. And then next to that we've got the Bristol Museum and Art Gallery today. But Angela Carter talks about it being the University Refectory, and it actually appears in one of her journal entries for this time, for the journal entry for May 1965. She wrote, "I was almost desperate today again, but the drugs," and this was some kind of painkillers to look after an arm injury, "seemed to be working, and my arm feels almost like its own self. But I felt so bad. I sat and drank soup in the refectory, and I felt like a stone in the rain." So I think it's fair to point out that Bristol's never actually mentioned in any of Angela Carter's novels, but nevertheless, as I've said, the first 5 novels were based on her experiences in living in the Clifton area. Those that are known as the Bristol Trilogy, which I put up on the previous slide. And the museum makes an appearance, particularly in her first novel, Shadow Dance of 1966. And so in that novel, the main character, Maurice Gray, he sort of takes to visiting the museum, which he describes the echoing coolness of the City Museum. And he's always particularly impressed by the Romany caravan, which you can see on the screen there, all Baroque paintwork and engraved mirrors with a stuffed tabby cat curled on the steps. And his favourite exhibit was the reassembled skeleton of an Irish elk, which he found there. So I'm really with Maurice Gray on this, because I used to come down to Bristol in the 1970s and 1980s with my parents, and it was always the Romany wagon that was a standout exhibit for me. I was also quite fond, there's a sort of a mock stuffed dodo in that collection as well, which I always thought was fantastic as well. So those were the things that stuck in my mind. So for Maurice, this museum in Bristol becomes a refuge from some of the conflicts of his home life and his domestic life, and also the alternative society of that area as well. So it sort of becomes this sort of fantasy world for him and his dreams. And I'm just gonna, we've just got a little extract. There we are.
He made a little home for himself.
So that's from the Shadow Dance.
Yeah, he made a little home for himself in the Romany caravan in the museum, sleeping among the cut glass and the mirrors engraved with bulging swags of grapes, or sitting at the controls of the fire engine, or curling up in an embryonic position in the rib cage of the great elk.
That's a fantastic image, isn't it? So again, if you know Bristol, we're gonna walk out of the museum. We're going to cross over at the crossing. This is a shot of that area. I think it's about 1970, this image. And we're going to go to that building in the middle, the Berkeley Cafe. And perhaps we can stop for a cup of coffee in there. Maybe that camp coffee we were talking about earlier. So, yeah, I think it's quite interesting. We always know that Paris had the Domago and those left bank cafes where the intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, they discuss literature and philosophy and current affairs. And then by the mid-1960s, Clifton also had cafes like this one, the Berkeley. Was that an equivalent of the left bank cafes of Paris? I don't know. That might be stretching a little bit. However, it does appear in Shadow Dance. So the cafe there is based on the Berkeley. Angela Carter writes of it, the management finally decided to drag the place by its ears into contemporaneity. It was forced against its will to become a coffee bar. So it's still there. It's a pub these days, but it was one of Angela Carter's favourite haunts when she studied literature at the University of Bristol. I had some communications with Gary Hicks, who used to edit the Nonesuch paper, the university paper at that time, and knew her at the time. And he described Angela Carter. He said that, recalled that she used to adopt a Paris left bank persona, as I recall, beret, corduroy jeans, Gauloise cigarettes. So she had this identity that she was creating at that time. It's also here that she caught up with Neil Curry, with whom she ran the University Literary Society, and he actually compiled a short poetry collection called Vision with her. And then he created another collection of verse later in life called Letters Never Sent, Verse Letters, where he fondly commemorated Angela Carter's presence in Bristol at that time, after the hours that we spent here. So that was remembering her later after she was no longer alive. So I think we can imagine Angela Carter sitting in the Berkeley Cafe in the 1960s, and she used to hang out with anarchist friends there. So they'd be critiquing the old world of bombed out Bristol and part of the rapidly declining British Empire. They'd be in a situation in the mid-60s, fearing the brink of destruction during the Cold War. They would have been there in the sort of just after the missile crisis in Turkey and Cuba. But also perhaps imagining, I like to think, and sharing a reconstructive vision of the future, perhaps proclaiming with the Spanish anarchist Buenaventura Durruti that we're not the least afraid of ruins. We carry a new world here in our hearts. This world is growing this minute. And her friend Susanna Clapp wrote, and I'm going to ask you to be Susanna Clapp as well, please, Marie.
In the Berkeley Cafe, she chatted to situationists and anarchists. As we sat in her kitchen in April 1991, 10 months before she died, Angela said these anarchists had had more influence than anyone else on her politics.
So if we walk down a bit further, cutting into Berkeley Avenue and take a turn into Berkeley Square now. So that's one of the lovely kind of Georgian Regency squares in that part of Bristol. Quite interesting that Angela Carter's biographer, Edmund Gordon, pointed to one of the things about Bristol in the 1960s, and when she got here, found it quite tough, was actually the lack of prospects. So in his biography, The Invention of Angela Carter, he talks about her trying to get a job at the local BBC, which is still very much based, an important base in Bristol. She tried to get a job as a reporter again with the Bristol Post. And she also tried to get a job as anybody that was in Bristol I don't know when it closed, but probably up to the 1990s, will remember a really large bookshop called George's Books, which took up the top blocks of Park Street, just next to Berkeley Square. She tried for a job there and didn't get one. So quite a discouraging start to her move to Bristol. But that made her resolve, as she noted in her journal at the time, I must strive to be an artist after all. So after that, she did start, she began an undergraduate degree in English literature in 1962. So that was, at that time, it's now in Woodlands Road, but at that time that would have been in the building to the right of the screen there. I hope you can see that behind our images, but there's a much more modern building there called the Alfred Marshall Building at 40 Berkeley Square. So I presume that may have been bombed during the war, and so there's a modern building that was put in to fill that place. In 1965, she completed a dissertation which was titled Some Speculations on Possible Relationships Between the Medieval Period and 20th Century Folk Poetry. So that title reflected her continuing interest in folk music. So that's quite a big part of our story today, her interest in folk story as well. And I think it's quite interesting. It's a perfect example of some of the many locations in Bristol where we've got really modern buildings constructed immediately next to more historic buildings. So in this case, Georgian or Regency buildings, but even medieval buildings. So that was redesigned in recent years. So it doesn't look quite that now, but it was originally constructed on concrete pillars so that cars could be parked underneath. And what Angela Carter would have experienced in the 1960s and seen around her was the sort of aftermath of the heavy Blitz of November 1940. So in the 1960s still, in fact, probably still in the 1980s, there were still some Blitz buildings. So Clifton itself would have been an amazing patchwork of beautifully preserved neoclassical architecture, but there would have been sites of ruin and bombed out dereliction. And there would have been views across the city centre undergoing the rapid construction boom that the Bristol Evening Post, where they described it as booming Bristol at that time. So quite an interesting urban environment that she was writing out of. And I think it's also ironic that now Angela Carter is in so many English syllabuses, that her private notes and her experience of at Bristol as an English student in Bristol University in 1963s, one of the comments she made might come as a little bit of a surprise. Marie.
I am very, very weary of English literature. The English department, hot and cold running, epiphanies in every lecture room, intuitive perception and moral awareness instantly synthesized. Why are we supposed to be learning responses, for God's sake? Poetry should make the young copulate, not evaluate.
Okay, so just past that building at the back of Berkeley Square, that takes us into Brandon Hill Park, and you can see Cabot Tower there as well. So that's the opening and the main setting for or many of the parts of Angela Carter's novel Love, written in 1969. And one of the main characters, Annabelle, troubled main character, felt that the magic strangeness of the park and enjoyed its overgrown paths with nervous pleasure. At the park centre, as you can see, it's cut off a little bit there, swaddled in greenery, that's Cabot's Tower there. So that's one of Bristol's most prominent landmarks. It was designed by William Gough Fenn in 1898, and it was constructed, as the name suggests, to celebrate John Cabot's links with Bristol before the explorer set off on his voyage to another landmass deemed to be theme again, a new world. Not a new world, of course, for the indigenous populations of Canada, of course, but it was an important image for identifying, I think, the city's role in the origins of transatlantic colonialism. But I think Brandon Hill Park's also held with affection for Bristol radical historians. It was the site of many of the political gatherings right the way back to the late 18th and early 19th century, for the electoral reform movement of that time, for the anti-slavery gatherings, for the Chartist movements of the mid-19th century, and right the way through to gatherings of striking workers in Carter's day during the 1960s. This is a bit of an aside, but the other thing I love about it is it's got a beaming light which beams out the name Brandon Hill Park, Bristol in Morse code throughout the year, although apparently it beams Merry Christmas at Christmas as well, which is quite nice. So that's stage 5 in the map. I think in the map we've written it's a fine day for a fantastic cityscape view of the cityscape of Bristol from up there when it's open. I believe it's still closed at the moment during the lockdown. And we've also had, it's a really excellent place to read an early Angela Carter novel. And there's an extract from Love there.
Annabel preferred the Gothic north, where an ivy-covered tower with leaded ogive windows skulked among the trees. Both these pretty whimsies were kept securely locked, in fear of the despoliation of vandals, but their presence still performed its original role, transforming the park into a premeditated theatre where the romantic imagination could act out any performance it chose, amongst settings of classic harmony or crabbed quaintness. And the magic strangeness of the park was enhanced by its curious silence. On her right, she saw the sun shining down on the district of terraces and crescents where she lived, while on her left, above the spires and skyscrapers of the city itself, the rising moon hung motionless in a rift of absolute night.
Okay, so again, if you know Bristol, we're leaving Brandon Hill Park now. We're crossing over Jacob's Wells Road. We're walking past a pub called the Eldon House. Then sorry, we've got to go up a really steep hill now. We've got to go up lower Clifton Hill, but there's no other way up to Angela Carter territory, I'm afraid. We might want to take a peek on the right-hand side as we go up the hill. You've got an interesting, slightly overlooked place called the Strangers' Burial Ground. And we're told that that's likely to be there's a reference to the padlocked and deserted cemetery that features in Shadow Dance. So this would have been the route that Angela Carter took from her home down the hill and down towards Bristol University when she was studying in the English department there. When we get to the top of the hill at last, it's time we can catch our breath in this pub here, which is the Lansdowne at 8 Clifton Road. So it's a lovely old Georgian pub. And this was really important in the folk scene in Bristol and the folk revival. And folk music, as I've already mentioned, was a really important aspect of Angela Carter's creative life during the 1960s. So they weren't just spectators, they were active participants and creators of the folk scene. And in 1964, her husband Paul Carter and Angela, they began what was called the Folk Song and Ballad Club. So they had on every Friday night up in the upstairs function room of that pub, they had regular folk nights which they organised. And Angela Carter sang ballads, and she became quite a proficient concertina player at that time. And they sort of left the folk scene when she split up with Paul Carter and left Bristol during the 1960s. But I think there's a lot about the colourful drama and the passion of those folk stories that really stayed with her. And I think there is a major influence on being woven into the stories and the use of the ballad tradition in her writing after that. So I think that was a really significant thing. Now there's some other interesting things, and this is some of the wonders of carrying out some oral history, as I managed to speak to some of Angela Carter's old friends who also used to be involved in various events at the Lansdowne there. And one thing was this thing called the Grot Club, and it's slightly difficult to get a feel for what this is, but that took place in the upstairs function room. I put a little picture of the function room in the insert there, so that's still there today. And so Angela Carter was involved with this circle and attended these events. So one of her friends, Bob Gale, who's an artist, he wrote burlesque scripts, and there was all these performances and happenings that took place upstairs in that pub, and all very 1960s. And one character that was involved with this scene was Marcel Steiner, who became quite a prominent, he's no longer alive, but became quite a prominent 1960s actor. And I quote the description of his: he was said to have been noted for stripping off his clothes, setting fire to himself, and also driving 4-inch nails into his head as a part of his performances. So he was involved with this scene. And one occasion, the anecdote I got was he's supposed to have been hung in a sort of a straitjacket from outside the windows of that pub in the Lansdowne. The other thing that the Grot Club got involved with, there was this sort of spoof religion which they called Mojoism. Although nobody really seems to know what that was all about, but in our terms today, it went viral, and it sort of took off in Clifton at that time in the late 60s. But I think it was all part of the sort of community surrealism, and that was of that time. And that was something that Angela Carter really wanted to be a part of and was very, very interested in. And that, again, I think that was another influence on her writing. So I'd say again that we know that in the late 1960s, she would have been sympathetic politically to some of the things that were going on there. So I've mentioned the strikers. So there was a aircraft industrial workers held a strike in Brandon Hill Park in the 1960s, and they included among their demands equal pay for women. So Angela Carter, very much a socialist feminist, would have been very sympathetic to those trade unionist demands. But it's interesting, I find that she also wanted equality and the transformative power of the imagination. So that's very Angela Carter, and I'm going to let Angela speak again there. Oh, you're still
The surrealists were all men, and they told me that I was the source of all mystery, beauty, and otherness because I was a woman, and I knew that was not true. I knew I wanted my fair share of the imagination too. Not an excessive amount, mind. I wasn't greedy, just an equal share in the right to vision.
Okay, so we're leaving the pub now. We're walking back down Clifton Road. We're taking a left. We're going past the birdcage walk. So the guy in the film clip earlier, when he was walking through a tunnel of leaves and flowers, that was actually the birdcage walk. So that's quite a famous location in Bristol. In fact, I believe there's even a novel named after that by Helen Simpson, I believe. So that's takes you through to the Fossway, and that takes you through a little alley which brings you out here to Savile Place, Clifton. So the part of this block, this terrace, another one of those wonderful Regency Georgian terraces that you find all over Clifton. The important part about this is where Angela Carter's friends Jenny and John Osborne used to live. And John Osborne was quite significant. So he was another painter, but he's supposed to be one of the prototypes or one of the influences for Honey Buzzard, the main character in the 1966 novel Shadow Dance. So I think it's quite an interesting novel because we're focusing on the what we're calling the provincial Bohemia and the counterculture in 60s, and that novel very much sort of shows the dystopian side of provincial Bohemia as well. So for John Osborne to be represented in this rather sinister character of Honey Buzzard is perhaps a bit of a doubtful tribute, really. So we've already come across Maurice Gray's, so he's his sort of partner in crime, as it were. So on the first of all, he's kind of a whimsical kind of pretty man, and he runs a bric-a-brac shop, and he's got all these the shop's stuffed with various finds from looting raids. And then he's got this, he's kind of full of brio in life. He's kind of got this, he's a practical joker. So apparently Angela Carter says that he likes joss sticks that smelt of old cheese. And he's got this collection of false noses, which he puts on. So he's this kind of, that kind of character. But then his name suggests he's also sweet, and there's also a sinister side to the kind of predatory aspect of the buzzard as well. So I think he's quite an interesting character, because he's on the one side, he's the kind of stock lovable rogue, but Angela Carter sets up that image in order to show the dystopian psychopathic side of that. So he's quite flirtatious, but he's also I'd say he was a psychopathic sadist, and he brutally attacks his former lover Ghislaine, and he envies other characters and he objectifies them. And it is hallmarks of a sociopath. He's got no sense of empathy. He's a manipulator. And I like this description of one of his fantasies of power and control, which I'm going to put up on the screen there.
I should like to have a floor set out in checkers and to play chess with men and women. I would stand on a chair and call out my moves from a megaphone, and they would click their heels and march forward. I'd put those that were taken in cages, the fools.
So that's a little extract of a track by Ian A. Anderson. So he lived, Ian A. Anderson was somebody who was really helpful with my research. And he lived in Royal York Crescent during the 1960s, and he actually brought an album called Royal York Crescent out in 1970. So that's a little extract from there. So now we've moved to Royal York Crescent itself. So number 38 was where Angela and Paul Carter lived. So they arrived in Bristol in 1961, and they lived in Royal York Crescent in number 38 right the way through till Angela left in 1969. After that point, Angela Carter moved to Japan and was separated from Paul Carter, and then they divorced. Another thing that was quite nice is I was talking to, again, I've mentioned Bob Gale earlier, so he was able to describe what the inside of the flat was like when Angela and Paul lived there. He said there was the hall, there was a very large room, there was the main sitting room, and then looking across the room, there was an Evans fireplace, which was quite fine because the building was built around 1800. There was a comfortable sofa, and there was a rocking chair which Angela had bought, in which she used to sit in. It was very moderately furnished. There were 2 steps to the kitchen on the left, and there were 2 rooms at the back, which were the study and a bedroom, and there was a rather fine mirror over the fireplace. So just about a year after the year they moved in, there was the long and bitterly cold winter of 1962 to 63. And I think it was quite interesting that there was the other chill in the air of 1962 was the Cold War probably took its most alarming turn. So NATO sighted nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, and then the Soviets sighted missiles in Cuba. And again, quite interesting talking to some Bristolians who remember this era, makes it clear that there were some really terrifying moments before the superpowers stepped back from the brink. One of the people I spoke to was the Bristolian Bob Baker, who's the scriptwriter for many TV programs. So he wrote episodes of Doctor Who, and he was also the co-author of several of the Wallace and Gromit Aardman classics as well. So he recalled to me wondering whether he could find a cave in the Avon Gorge to shelter his family in due to the nuclear attack that was absolutely certain was coming at that point. So we had the Cold War, the ongoing Vietnam War, the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. So that really brought about widespread disaffection and resistance to the failures of the old world, both of the United States and also of the Soviet Union alike, particularly on the part of the New Left. Alongside this rejection of the establishment, though, it was an interesting time as a euphoric period of experimentation and a re-energized hope for a new world of fresh possibilities embraced by the Woodstock generation. It's obviously named after the famous festival of 1969. Reflecting on those heady years, 20 years later, Angela said,
because towards the end of the 60s, it started to feel like living on a demolition site. One felt one was living on the edge of the unimaginable. There was a constant sense of fear and excitement, and of course, it was to do with war. There's no denying that towards the end of the decade, everyday life, even where I was living in Bristol, took on the air of a continuous improvisation. The particularly leafy and graceful bit of Bristol where I lived attracted festival behaviour, carpe diem, pleasure. It didn't have to cost much either.
The rain came down like beads, bouncing on the noses of the people from the train. A flock of starchy ears sparkled in the traffic lights, feet squelched soggy leaves across the grain. I took my love to Clifton in the rain.
so that's Al Stewart's Clifton in the Rain. I think that probably most captures the vibe of 1960s Clifton. So I love that song. So now we're at stop 9, probably time for a drink again. So we're going to go into the Somerset House. We're now in 11 Princess Victoria Street in Clifton. And I've had a letter recently from a poet called Chris Torrance, who lived in Bristol during the 1960s. And he wrote that this part of Bristol had the reputation as England's equivalent to San Francisco. So he's talking about Haight-Ashbury there, presumably during the 1960s and 1970s. And Princess Victoria Street and that surrounding area around there seems to be the absolute centre of this countercultural activity. And as today, there were many university students in that area as well. So there was an indoor craft second-hands market called Focus. There was the Splinters Cafe, but there was the Troubadour Club as well. So that was a nationally famous club on the folk scene and on the blues scene. So that's where Al Stewart would have played and many others at that time. So that's tucked away just off of Princess Victoria Street in Waterloo Street. Musician Ian A. Anderson, we've already come upon or listened to. He started to put Clifton Village on some of his posters during the 1960s. So again, that was echoing Greenwich Village in New York, sort of capital of the alternative society at that time. So capturing the groovy vibe again, and that label Clifton Village is still stuck to a certain extent. So at that time, Princess Victoria Street would have been more of a rundown, much more affordable area. So there would have been quite a few independent businesses there, workshops, and some pubs as well. So because it was more affordable, there was much more opportunity for creative work to take place, for a little bit of art and experimentation. So something of an alternative society appeared and emerged in that area at that time. And I think really the pubs were one of the main centres for that. So they would have been the primary attractions for Angela Carter and the people that she was hanging out with at the time. And so we've got the Somerset there. It was famous for members of the local counterculture, and the people that that expression Angela Carter used was Provincial Bohemia, and I think she was talking about venues like this. So this was one of her favourite venues for some of her friends at the time. I'm sure she would have been there herself. And I had a description from Mike Hamlin, who was a pub regular at that time in Bristol in the 1960s. He now lives up in Nottingham. And he said that the Somerset attracted a relaxed, hippie-ish clientele, and they'd gather for discussions and they'd read underground newspapers like the International Times and the Black Dwarf at that time. And another friend of Angela Carter's, Bob Gale, I've mentioned previously, he described it beautifully as a Hogarthian centre where students, business people and prostitutes mingled. Sadly, that pub closed last year, I believe, in 2019. So didn't even make it into 2020, where we've lost potentially losing other Bristol pubs. According to a journal entry written in 1965, Angela Carter also began to sketch out a new novel. And this one was called Pretty Tomorrow, and that was to capture the snapshots of the emerging optimism of this swinging culture in Clifton and around the rest of the city. And she said that she had an idea that would include a local band called Dream City, which is supposed to be a bit like bands, West Coast American bands again, like Loving Spoonful or the Byrds. And it's quite interesting to see what she had in mind for this novel. So she listed the contents in one of her journals.
A picture of the popular culture of a provincial city. Discotheques, clubs, wrestling, pop concerts, pub music, etc., etc., etc. Ice rink, the cats. Maybe because I'm happy now and suddenly, I want Pretty Tomorrow to be a really gay kind of book, a book of delights. I can leave the doom until I'm older.
So Angela Carter was involved with, she worked at the Locarno for a while, I believe, and the zoo. So she sort of tapped into the wider Bristol scene. She was quite interested in wrestling, I believe. She wrote about wrestling a bit later. So I think she was always kind of fascinating with some of those aspects of working class culture. So that was a novel that she sketched out, but it didn't become one of her Bristol novels. But it looks like it was there to try and capture the vibe of the swinging 60s. But her buoyant mood didn't last very long, and I think she ditched the whole project after about 5 months. But I think probably a lot of the energy from that particular idea did find its way into a more positive project that did survive, and that was some of the material I think was probably repurposed into several Perceptions, which was another one of her 1960s Bristol novels, published in 1968. And that was really significant because that novel was awarded the Somerset Maugham Literary Prize. So that was a national literary prize that she was awarded. And I think that was really significant step on her professional journey to becoming a writer, a professional writer.
It's good to be alive, although the roof is leaking too. 40 missing floorboards, 50 frantic far out price below.
Okay, so that was Stackridge, who are also based in this area during the 1960s. So that song is 32 West Mall. That's supposed to be rain pouring in the background, the sound effects there. Other interesting thing to know about Stackridge is they were the very first band to play the first Glastonbury Festival, I think in 1971, around about that time. So we've come to another pub now. This is the Bristol Fringe at number 32 Princess Victoria Streets are in the same road. So that pub was formerly called the Greyhound. So in the picture there, you can see the old inn sign called the Greyhound before it was called the Bristol Fringe. And that was another venue very much associated with alternative Bristol. And that's where Angela and Paul Carter used to spend time with their friends. They regularly drank there, perhaps I'm sure they would have brushed shoulders with Keith Floyd, the celebrity chef who opened his first bistro in Princess Victoria Street in the 1960s. And he was good friends with Bob Baker, the scriptwriter I've already mentioned, he lived nearby at Windsor Terrace. So the Greyhound is the setting for Shadow Dance, and that's it features is the Gloucester. So in the opening scene of Shadow Dance takes place in the Gloucester, and it appears later in that novel. So the alehouse drinkers that appear in Shadow Dance are in reality based on kind of a pastiche of various people that Angela Carter would have spent time with in the Greyhound during the 1960s. So I like the way that really from Angela Carter's fictional accounts, we can build up this picture of the 1960s and 1970s alternative society. And in my writing, I also looked at first-hand accounts. So we've already mentioned some of the memories of people who would have been participated in that scene at the time, but then there was other primary sources like the pages of the Underground Press. There were newsletters of the women's and gay liberation movements at that time. There was housing activist newsletters. We've still got some music performances we've given you a sample of today, the visual arts, and some of the pioneering experiments in renewable energy were really interesting. So nearby in Bath, there was a community technology festival, which was a national event called Comtech, which was really part of the sort of a vision of the new world that was being put forward by the alternative society as well. So just parallel and just down the hill from Princess Victoria Street and from Royal York Crescent, we've got Cornwallis Crescent in Bristol. This was still a lovely historic crescent, and that was home to several of other Angela Carter's friends, and particularly some of her first friends there, Janet and Peter Swan. So Peter Swan was a notable Bristolian artist. And then also in that crescent, there was Karina and Nick Gray. So they lived in number 11. And Karina's significant in the story because Karina stayed a really close friend of Angela Carter and one of her key creative collaborators. So she's the person who illustrated Angela Carter's Virago books of fairies during the 1990s. There were also neighbours there and good friends of Karina Gray and Nick Gray were Barry and Sue Flanagan. So Barry Flanagan was a really successful and famous sculptor who lived in Bristol during the early 1960s, and it sounds like he was really one of the great characters of this area. And I love the description by John Poet, his friend, John James, his friend who was a poet at that time, and he has this lovely description, fondly remembering Barry Flanagan taking off around Clifton and Hotwells after he'd done his work in the studio. And I think it's absolutely brilliant evocation of Bohemia, provincial Bohemia that we're looking at today. So I'm just going to read you that extract. I'll read this one. I'll be John James this afternoon. A dandy flaneur, he would saunter out from his apartment on Cornwallis Crescent and stroll for miles of an evening, especially on the pavements of Clifton, between the pale cream stone of serene buildings such as the Royal Crescent and the West Mole. At night, below Clifton to the south, the lights of Hotwells next to the river Avon would illuminate the sky. Flanagan referred to Bristol as handsome and the docks as reassuring. He did have a special bond with the place, which he retained long after moving away. Jessica Sturgis, his partner of many years, told me that whenever they passed within its vicinity later, he would doff his hat to what he recalled the mother and father of all cities. He would frequent the Bohemian haunts of Bristol, such as the Black Boy Cafe on Black Boy Hill, and the cider houses, the Quinton House in Clifton, the Cotton Porter stores, and the Ostrich in Hotwells. These were used by a heterogeneous community of prostitutes, Second World War veterans, working men, gangsters, students. He floated through this crowded demi-monde. Okay, now as we move to our final stop on the tour today, we've got a little bit of a treat for you. So I'm going to play this. I think I'm going to play this first of all. So that is Angela Carter herself singing "The Flower of Sweet Strabane," and that is, that is the only recording of Angela Carter singing. So we're really, really pleased to be able to play that, and really grateful to Chris Molan for allowing us to play an extract for that. So we've now moved to the Bear Hotel in Hotwells, which I've said is the final place on our tour. So again, we've been to the Lansdowne, but actually before that, Angela's husband, Paul Carter, he was a major figure in the English folk revival. In the 1960s, he's the director of Tropic Records, which was the major folk revival record label. And together they began another regular folk club here called this time the Ballads and Broadsides at the Bear in Hotwells. So we mentioned at the outset, they'd taken part in an early Aldermaston March, and the folk revival really further connected them to the campaign for nuclear disarmament and the trade union movement as well, because they're both involved with a travelling cultural festival called Centre 42 at that time. And with the relatively recent detonation of nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's not really surprising that the current nuclear Armageddon was a dominant concern, and world peace was an urgent aspiration for Angela Carter and her circle at that time. So I think at the end, it's quite nice to imagine Angela Carter's socialising with their new circle of Bristolian friends, sharing music and song, perhaps an ale or two, and discussing the events of the day in this pub, the Bear Hotel. But there's also the Plume of Feathers a little bit further down, and then Mardyke a bit further down for that. So we know that she went to all of those pubs at that time as part of the folk scene. So there's just a few more aspects of Angela Carter's life in Bristol that I'd like to discover, I suppose, really. So I think one of the joys of rather unofficial primary research, like I've carried out in oral history, is that additional information just keeps coming to light as well. But I'd still like to know a little bit more about how Angela Carter responded to some of the really significant events that took place in Bristol, but actually were also significant in the national context at that time. One was the famous Bristol bus boycott of 1963. So that was a major event in the civil rights movement this side of the Atlantic, and also the major student occupation that took place at the University of Bristol in 1968. So that's about 4 years after Angela Carter finished her degree there, but she still would have been living in Bristol at that time. So I'd have been interested in her response to that. We know that she was regarded at the end of the Vietnam War as one of the great achievements of the anti-war movement. So that was really significant. She attended some of the folk events that were staged to raise funds to oppose the war. And it appears as a theme quite heavily in several perceptions, but we don't know how she was involved with the anti-war Vietnam war marches in Bristol, whether she took part in those marches or whether she was a part of those groups. The other thing that was very interesting is the Bristol Women's Liberation Group the one in Bristol was a really major early part of that movement. And its key members, when it started in 1969, they lived around Redland and Clifton at the time when Angela Carter was there. So I'd really be interested to know whether there are any stronger connections with those, although that was the year that she moved away. And I'm sure there's lots more to find out about the counterculture in Bristol during the 1960s. So there's a few snapshots. That's the Troubadour audience down on the bottom right hand corner. That's Ian Anderson and his friends around the time that snatch of music would have been recorded. In the top right, that's The Seeds, which was an underground magazine that was actually produced in Bristol. I know nothing more about that magazine. I've got 2 copies of it, 2 issues, but I know nothing more about that. So that would be very interesting. The Bristol Downs Festival was one of the first free festivals that took place in the UK, 1971. So that's another interesting piece of local countercultural history. And then that's one of the anti-Cuba, hands-off Cuba marches, I should say, in 1962 as well, which is a nice image there as well. So lots more to find out about the counterculture. Just thinking about, so Angela Carter, as I say, moved away from Bristol in 1969. She split up with Paul Carter, her husband, and then divorced. And when she came back to England from Tokyo in the 1970s, things had already changed, and she started to reflect on that changing situation over the couple of years when she was away. And she has experienced sort of what are sometimes known as the long 1960s, which were seen as carrying on into the early 1970s, came to a close at that stage. And she wrote, "For a brief season, it seemed like the old barriers of class and privilege were, if not actually down, at least crumbling." So she's talking about the sort of mid to late 1960s there. But then there's a note of disillusionment comes in, and she says, "I can see innumerable signs of change here, but no signs of growth," she wrote in 1972 when she came back to the country. So that points to her understanding that positive and authentic social transformation is an aspiration way beyond just the fact of change, which obviously happens all the time. I like the fact that the writer and activist Joan Smith referred to Angela Carter as really as many senses a child of the 60s, of the revolution in style, taste, and politics that occurred at that time. And I think it's probably true that her wide-ranging experiences and commentary upon the 1960s and 1970s, in a small way, they do contribute to the way that those decades have been framed, just through her wide-ranging journalism and her prose writings as well. And a television program screened during the 1980s was even called Queen Victoria Died in 1960. And I think that's very much an idea that echoes Angela Carter's symbolic description. And I've tried to create a Queen Victoria there, but she makes a description of broken in half, the bust of Queen Victoria rolled in the grate. So really a symbolic image of late Victorian icon there. And I think that also, for me, that also reminded me of the symbolic and literal rocking and rolling of the statue of Edward Colston earlier in the summer. So the dominant 18th century slave trader during the summer here. So that was, even though he's around in the 18th century, the the statue was very much around the made during the late Victorian era. So I think it's quite interesting that Queen Victoria 2020 is also only quietly heralded because of the situation we're in, but there's a new memorialisation in the form of a plaque to Angela Carter, which I put up on the screen there. So that was the Clifton and Hotwells Improvement Society. So they've installed this dark green plaque that's now at the house or the flat at number 38 Royal Crescent to mark her residence there. I think we're going to have to wait till the coronavirus constraints are lifted before there's an official ceremony. But it's also interesting to see on that plaque that she's described as a novelist, a poet, and a journalist. So, of course, now she's far more renowned for her short stories than as a poet, but that was quite accurate when referring to her period in the 1960s, because we had to wait for the 1970s before the short story collections like Fireworks and The Bloody Chamber came along. And I've just put this up because I was just reflecting. I think it's really interesting to think about memorialization and recognition. And one thing that came to mind was my partner Fiona and I, we were traveling through years ago, and we met a couple, a Swiss and Canadian couple. We were traveling on the train, on the Marrakesh Express, as a matter of fact. And we started talking to this couple, and they were going down to the south of Morocco to meet the Tuareg people, and they were social anthropologists. And we had a bit of a discussion and said, well, what kind of questions do you ask in order to investigate that culture and get a feel for the culture? And they said one of the very first questions they ask is, who does that particular society respect? And I thought that was very interesting, because I think in the present day, it might be significant that a really controversial figure like Edward Colston, who's so prominent in Bristol city centre, he's substantially lost his respect recently due to associations with crimes against humanity, which I would agree with. But then we've got respect for the contrarian writer and feminist socialist like Angela Carter has now been awarded a particular plaque in the city. So I think perhaps that does note a certain amount of cultural growth as well as change in the city, rather than just a change. And I think perhaps it's also a sign that Angela Carter has finally been recognised as a Bristolian at last. So I'm going to finish there in a moment. I was just going to finish off with reflections on the present day as well. So we're all coming to terms with this very bit of a roller coaster of a year, 2020. And I think we're probably obviously we're in the throes of a particular year when we're all talking about things being unprecedented and uncharted territory and unprecedented uncertainty. And yet it's quite easy to forget the situation during the 1960s as well, and the huge amount of challenges and crises that beset the period when Angela Carter was living there. So she would have been coming to terms with the aftermath of 2 world wars, the Holocaust, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, some of the most tense standoffs of the Cold War. So we don't know. Perhaps the present is even more volatile and uncertain. We don't. Just time will tell. But certainly this year has been an odd one, as we all know, and it's been a weird one because things have been really fast moving, even though a lot of things have stopped this year and slowed and stood still. And I just say at the end that alongside the real deaths and the distress of the coronavirus pandemics, we've had the plunging economy, concerning developments in international relations, conspiracy theories, the unstable situation in the United States, Brexit uncertainty. The counterculture in Bristol has stayed really strong, is very much a live force. So first of all, and there's some images of that on the screen there. So first of all, we've had the pandemic. When that happened in the spring, then there was a response from the counterculture in terms of all the mutual aid community groups and neighbourhood the groups that split up. So that's on the left hand side. You can see some of the food in one of the social centres called Cabelli in Bristol, or now called Base. So that was a centre for that. So that was one thing that happened. There was that really electric, carnivalesque experience in Bristol the day that the Colston statue was toppled, and then there were the ongoing Black Lives Matter protests through the through July and through the summer of that year. At the back there's an Extinction Rebellion, which was that's an occupation of the top of the and a protest at the top of the council house in the centre of Bristol. And then we've got one or two other images there. So the airport expansion was rejected this year. So quite a few things that there were the school's climate students were on the march. So quite a few other things were going on around the counterculture this year. So I'm going to finish there. So this is a guided walk around some of the places that Angela Carter would have known in her neighbourhood in the 60s. Places that really inspired her literature, I would say, in conclusion. So she had a really interesting perspective on the counterculture. She was surprised by it, curious about it. I think aspects of it really appalled her as well. But it very much inspired those first three novels. And it is some of the conflicts, some of the fault lines within the Provincial Bohemia. So some of those utopian aspects, but also some of the dystopian aspects as well. So I think that's quite a good, this year it could be quite a good time to reflect upon the historic counterculture that she captures as well, and what makes Bristol associated with community resistance and the counterculture today, and what about it is able to put forward perhaps some creative visions for a potentially reconstructive future. And that's very much kind of critiquing the old world, but also putting forward a reconstruction of the future as well. And as we all know, we're coming to terms with the coronavirus pandemic. We're thinking about the new normal, already a bit of a cliche, but we're thinking about, well, is that a possibility for a slightly more inclusive, slightly more democratic, ecologically sustainable society? And could we be on the threshold of what Angela Carter described as truly feeling like a year one again in 2021? So let's give Angela Carter the final words.
But should this entire planet survive so long as another 400 years, by then all may be changed. We will have our personal utopias, our own versions of William Morris's News from Nowhere. Looking on the bright side, there is just a chance, however faint, that this England of the remote future will resemble something like a kind of permanent Notting Hill Carnival.
Hello, can you hear me? I'm Charlotte too, because my computer crashed. I don't know if you can say in the chat whether you can hear me. And I couldn't look at the chat or unmute myself or anything. So I'm not sure if people can hear me.
We can hear you.
Yes, we can
hear you.
Okay,
so I've managed to zoom in from another device. I'm in another room and I can't turn the volume off on the original device. So that's in the other room. It's a nightmare. Anyway, I feel quite moved by that, Steve. That was very moving, the ending to your talk, in the sense of, what would she have made of Trump? What would she have made of Boris Johnson and the situation that we find ourselves in now? And yeah, I'm nearly crying. So thank you so much for that. So what's going to happen now is I think that Marie and you are going to kind of have a conversation. And I was supposed to be looking at the chat, which I will try to do, but I'm on my mobile phone and it's a bit different than the desktop setup. So I don't know if you can also keep an eye on the chat yourselves and answer questions. Do you know how to find the chat, you guys?
Yeah.
I'm just pulling that up now. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay, because I don't think I can really do it from my mobile phone. But I'm just going to join in the conversation and just be here. But the reason there's another blank Charlotte Crofts because my computer's still on, and if I log out, the Zoom meeting will end. After all the technical difficulties, it was me that had them.
Charlotte, can people unmute and ask questions, or have they to ask questions through the chat?
They need to ask. I think I'd prefer it if people ask questions through the chat. There's lots of lovely comments coming through. Just because I can't field the Q&A because I'm not on my laptop anymore, if you could just stick to the chat. There is one question in the chat, so in the Q&A. So there's a thank you for a very interesting session. I'd be interested to know if any of the panelists have ever thoughts on influence of folk music on Angela Carter's prose style. So we know that there is research being done on this by Polly Uzma. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Sorry, Polly, if you're here. But if you're in the chat, perhaps you can say more about that, Polly.
I can remember a few things that Polly said. If Polly wants to interrupt me at any time, please do. But Polly does talk about a real influence of the patterns of the language in the Bloody Chamber and how it corresponds to patterns in folk songs. And it's very original research. And Polly's going to be publishing her chapter on this in our forthcoming book, Pyrotechnics, that Charlotte and I are co-editing. So we're really excited to see this. And we were delighted to hear Angela Carter's own voice coming through in the clip that Steve played, and thanks to Chris Molan. And I also wanted to say that when we had the exhibition at the RWA, Chris and I organised a folk concert for people who had sung with Angela Carter 50 years ago, and it was incredibly moving. And Charlotte has filmed it and is going to be posting that concert on our website, which is called getangelacarter.com. So I think it would be great timing to be able to see that concert and for Polly's chapter to come out. And also Polly did a wonderful celebration for Angela Carter's 80th birthday a few months ago. She did a folk concert and she played the music that Angela Carter played. And so it's very exciting work that Polly's doing. And I think these links with the folk scene in Bristol are very important and have been really overlooked. And I think Chris Molan made the point originally that Angela Carter embraced a folk culture in the folk music scene. And also, as we heard academically for her third-year dissertation when she was at Bristol University. But then that sort of transposed, as it were, into folk and fairy tale. So she carried through that oral tradition from music and music notation and words. And in the exhibition, I helped Chris arrange a sort of area that was devoted to the folk music. And it was very exciting to see music that Angela Carter had actually transcribed, folk music, because she'd gone with Paul to record folk singers around the country, but she'd also taken down the actual musical notes of this oral tradition. So I think it's a part of her history that really belongs to Bristol. So thank you for everybody who's been involved with that.
Well, there's a nice message from Sarah Gamble about Polly's article being published recently. Sorry, the chat's disappeared, so I can't read the rest of it. So talk amongst yourselves, Marie and Steve, and I'll just see if there's any other.
Yeah. Okay, Steve. Well, thank you. That was really fantastic and very well done. And I just wanted to follow up really on a very general point, which is really to think about Angela Carter's relationship to Bristol and what Bristol's relationship is to Angela Carter. One of the things I noticed in her novel, The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman, is that she's writes about a city which people tend to think is Tokyo, but I think it's got characteristics of Bristol. And she describes Bristol as being a very male city, with being very comfortable and well off, really. So she sees it as a masculine kind of place. But I just wondered if you had anything to say about her relationship to Bristol and Bristol's relationship to her.
No, I think it's a sort of slightly ambivalent relationship to a certain extent, because obviously her marriage here wasn't successful. And I think when she moved here, as I mentioned, she wasn't able to find any work, and there was this kind of grim atmosphere with the Cuban Missile Crisis and that really harsh winter. But it seems that she sort of turned that to account. That's sort of when she made up her mind to be a creative genius, if you will. So that was, yeah, it was almost like the lack of opportunities kind of opened up that space for her to reflect on her situation and develop herself. And I don't think she, going to Bristol University and studying literature, I imagine she would have been a very different writer if she hadn't done that. On the other hand, you could say, well, she may have gone to a very good English language department in another city. So what did Bristol offer? And I think you're right. I think that probably the folk scene was certainly something that she found here. And I think that the culture in Bristol was a big influence on her in many ways. And if you think about it, she arrived here, I think she's probably about 21. She was unemployed. And she would have spent, because she died at the relatively young age of about 52, I think she probably spent about a third of her life or more in the West Country. I mean, she lived in Bristol in the in Bath in the mid 1970s for 3 or 4 years as well. So that's a really considerable time, part of her life, when she was spent that time here developing as a writer and left the city as a writer. So I think that's really significant. And I suppose it's important for us to reflect upon, well, what does she take from Bristol in order to develop in that way? And I think, yeah, some of the things I've been talking about were really influential. And I don't know, we often think about the underground being a kind of very much a London phenomenon. And I think she was very much, I mean, Zoe Brennan, I think, describes her as London centric. So she kind of comes here. She was a fantastic people watcher and an observer of life. So she was a part of these circles, but she was obviously something of an outsider as well. But she would sort of sit in the pubs, lots of notes of her just observing people. And very often those notes appear later in her novels. So I think there's things that she got from Bristol that she wouldn't have got from anywhere else. And in terms of the provincial counterculture, there are places like Canterbury and Brighton possibly, but they were probably still very much sort of satellites of the London scene. So from looking at provincial Bohemia, I think she was probably one of the best places to experience that. Even Liverpool, apparently, with the Beatles, there wasn't that much going on in Liverpool beyond the Beatles. There was there was obviously the beat scene there, but I don't think the counterculture would have been quite the same in Liverpool in the late 60s, early 70s. So Bristol was very much the place to be. So I think that was really important as well.
Yeah. Could I just pick up on what you said about her time as an undergraduate studying English at Bristol University? It's possible that we have in our audience a very important guest who was one of Angela Carter's tutors, and that's Professor John Scattergood, who I've invited, and he did say he would try and join us, so hopefully he did. But he was a medievalist, and he was supervising her for a master's degree on Merlin in Middle English text. And I recently gave a lecture at Angela Carter conference that the Angela Carter Society hosted in Lausanne, and I looked at the influence of Middle English text on her writing, and with the help and guidance, I have to say, Professor Scattergood. And this can be seen as something directly going to her experiences at Bristol, where they had a very strong medievalist teaching staff there, and it influenced her to pursue postgraduate work, and certainly it's had I think a very large important effect on an influence on her novels. So I think that's another aspect. I think we keep discovering more and more reasons as to why Bristol was so important to Angela Carter in so many different ways. It was also the place. Yes,
be fantastic if Professor Scattergood could speak, that would be amazing, wouldn't it? If he is available.
There's a question in the chat, and I don't know if Professor Scattergood's in the audience, then he can say in the chat if he's here. But Sarah Gamble's asked if you could speak a bit more to Angela Carter's poetry and involvement with the poetry scene in Bristol, any magazines or publications and so on.
I'm not sure I could say too much about that. I know that I spotted references to the Resuscitator, which was an important poetry magazine of that time, and that was contributed to by John James, who I've mentioned today, Chris Torrance, another poet called Nick Waite, who I don't know that much more about. So she was aware of those slightly alternative poetry publications. There was also the Bristol Arts Centre was in King's Square at that time, and in some ways it's still there in the form of the Cube multiplex, if people from the West Country know that building. But that still continues that cultural tradition, and that there would have been many poets. That probably would have been the main place for performance poetry, and also the Anna Feeney was also underway at that time. So she would have tapped into that scene. It's something I'd be really interested to find out a little bit more. And obviously she was a poet herself and produced the Vision collection, and some of her poetry has been published as the Unicorn, I believe. But are you able to speak to that anymore, Marie or Charlotte?
Looks like she's still there.
Yes, I'd just like to say that Sarah Gamble has got a chapter in this book on Angela Carter and poetry, and I mean Charlotte's Sarah Gamble. Sarah's really the expert on Carter and poetry. But what I think is important just to stress is as far as we know, that's where she started getting poetry published. But I have to say that Charlotte and I went to Angela Carter's old school, did we not, Charlotte? And we spoke to the girls there, and they showed us the school magazines, and in there she had poetry that she'd written as a schoolgirl, and it was remarkably good, I thought, for the age that she was at. And so we have reproduced this poetry in our Angela Carter newsletter. And for those of you who don't know about that, we have an annual newsletter with lots of exciting articles. Charlotte's got a particularly amazing one about a phallic, how can I put it, Charlotte? A phallic festival in Japan. But if you join the Angela Carter Society, then you get a copy of this newsletter, and you can certainly see the very first poetry we think that Angela Carter actually wrote in there.
Yes, so I put a link to the Angela Carter Society in the chat, and it's very reasonable annual fee, and you get the newsletter when you join. And I think it's £20 for wage, 10 for student, and 5 for unwaged, or something like that. And that also enables you to enter the Angela Carter essay competition. And we have an annual conference. We just had an amazing annual conference that was beamed live from Switzerland and in Lausanne. So it's a very vibrant academic society, but it's welcome. Anyone's welcome from any walk of life. You don't have to be an academic to be a member of the society. It's all about celebrating Angela Carter scholarship and her life and work. There's another question, a couple of questions in the Q&A. One was about Angela Carter's drama, and can I speak to that one? Given that
you're the expert on the radio plays.
Yeah, so Angela Carter wrote a number of radio plays, and the first one was Vampirella, which then ended up being adapted as a short story in the Bloody Chamber collection, but most people will have encountered it first through that collection as The Lady of the House of Love. But it started as a radio drama, and it was inspired by the sound effect of running a pencil on a radiator, which she imagined was the fingernail of Vampirella. Sorry, I've got a dog rolling around on the floor next to me. If you hear some strange noises, that's what it is. It's not me. Of course, she went on to have a number of her works adapted. She tried to get a couple of stage projects off the ground. One was the National's adaptation of Lulu. She was a massive fan of the Pabst film, but that didn't go forward. And then there was another one, which was a opera. She was writing the operetta of Orlando. Obviously Virginia Woolf's Orlando, and that didn't get off the ground. And she felt very let down by those projects not getting off the ground. And in her writing, she did write rather scathingly about British acting on TV. She called it acting up on the small screen, and she wasn't that keen on British trained theatre actors really projecting. I think she really liked sort of screen acting more rather than theatre acting. But theatre, theatricality, performance are obviously absolutely key themes in her writing and work, and I think she was really excited by that idea, and there have been lots of really interesting stage adaptations of her work, including Wise Children by the theatre company named after Wise Children, and Nights at the Circus. So I think theatre and theatricality are incredibly important. Do you want to speak to that, Marie, as well?
No, I think I mean the theatricality is very important, and there's also been so many adaptations of her work as well, and then there's the Angela Carter musicals we did as well a couple of years ago, adaptations from the Bloody Chamber. So yeah, I think, as you say, her music, her work lends itself to theatricality, and perhaps less so to filmmaking, but you might disagree with that, Charlotte. But
I think film's another strand in her writing. There's some more questions if I can feed them to you. There's a really good question here, which is about Steve. You said that Bristol never makes an appearance in her work, and somebody, it's Carol Davison, loved hearing what Marie just said about Carter possibly masking the city in her work. And she says that given Bristol's association with the transatlantic colonialism and slave trading, as Steve pointed out, are there references or traces to this history, even generally, in Carter's work? The one that springs to mind for me is when she, in the Magic Toy Shop, I can't remember the character's name now. Is it Melanie or Marianne or something like that? Melanie. Says she's discovering her body, her sort of teenage nubile body, and she says, "Oh, my America, my newfound land." Yeah. So yes, I think she was. She talks about decolonializing our basic habits of thought in her writing. She's trying to do that in her writing, and I think that was particularly so after she'd experienced Japan. And I think somebody asked a question about her experiences in Japan, and I know I'm just kind of like rambling now and not giving anyone else a chance to answer, but I know that Natsumi Okoma, who's a Japanese scholar, is in the audience, and she invited me to Japan, and we visited the fertility festival that Angela Carter writes about in her journalism, which was really exciting. And yes, the experience in Japan, I think, was really, really seminal. And that's kind of where she went after Bristol. And then she came back to the UK and lived in Bath, which also features in Steve's book. And maybe we need to do another tour about Bath, Steve.
Maybe that would be fantastic. Yeah, I feel like it would be. I'd be really interested to find out a bit more about what was going in Bath at the time. But there is a book coming out about Bath Arts Workshop, which never seems to quite get launched, but I know they've been working on it for a couple of years. So the people that founded the Bath Arts Workshop, and I should just say that was it's kind of connected to the Arts Lab and the Underground in London, but it was one of the really important examples of that locally. So Bath had a very big, there were lots of free festivals going on, particularly in the mid-70s. And I think I mentioned in passing the Comtech festivals, the community technology festivals. So if we're thinking about a new world, that was really kind of yesterday's tomorrow's world, as it were. That was really significant in that respect. Angela Carter lived in Hay Hill, probably 73, 76, something like that. And she was involved, she had some good friends called Shirley Cameron and Roland Miller, who again were very much part of they were performance artists, and she did some work with them in Bath. So she tapped into the whole Bath Arts Workshop scene, but that was a really kind of fully developed alternative society going on in Bath by the mid-70s, focused on the Walcott area, which I think is very interesting. And she does write about Bath in one or two essays as well. So there's one about Bath as a heritage city. She also has a little bit of a go at the New Vegetarians. So there she's talking about Harvest Whole Foods, which is in Bristol and Bath to this day. And she's slightly mocking of vegetarians and macrobiotic diets, fortunately.
There's a comment from Caleb Sivia, who runs the wonderful Angela Carter Online. It's a website, there's a Facebook group and a Twitter feed. and he's also a colleague of ours at UWE Bristol. And he says he's written a short piece about Carter and Bath that's available on Angela Carter online, and that he's put the link in the chat.
Yeah, can I just say there that I was very privileged to go to Bath with Christopher Frayling, has written a book called Inside the Bloody Chamber about, and it's a lot about the time that he spent with Angela Carter. They both lived in Bath, and he took me to a nursing home to meet Edward Horwich, who Angela Carter had lived with while she was in Bath, and that was the time when she was, I think she was the secretary for the branch of the Labour Party at the time in Bath. And I think Steve pointed out in his books that very sadly the records have been destroyed for the time that she was in that position, because it would have been fascinating to have known more about her involvement with the Labour Party in Bath at that time. But when she was in Bath, she wrote The Sardian Woman, and also Jeanette was asking about Vampirella, and Charlotte responded to Vampirella, and Christopher Frayling says that the story of Vampirella, which is about a vampire who has as a prey a young man who arrives at the castle on a bicycle. It's a sort of sleeping, reworking of Sleeping Beauty, was actually based on Christopher Frayling, who went to Transylvania. I think it was in a Renault, not a bicycle, but he went around Transylvania, and when he came back, he gave Carter the idea of having this, this young man going into the land of the vampires, really. So he traces it back to there. And during the Strange Worlds exhibition, I was very fortunate to be able to get a manuscript of the Lady of the House of Love, as well, a typed manuscript. And of course, as Charlotte pointed out, Vampirella was really the thing that started off the short story. So it wasn't the short story, wasn't the radio play wasn't the adaptation. The short story was the adaptation from the original radio play. So so I just thought I'd share that about Bath. It was a very creative time, but not as much as Bristol, when they think about the number of novels that she actually produced while she was living in Bristol. And I just wanted to mention that I think she had a rather ambivalent relationship with Bristol, because when I invited her to come to talk to my students in Bristol, she was very hostile to the idea. And at the time, I hadn't realised that she'd got divorced from one of my colleagues, Paul Carter, who I'd worked with briefly on a science society and the media degree. He was a chemist, and it was an innovation that the university had of bringing the arts and sciences together. So I had a bit of contact with him then, and was warned not to mention Angela Carter to him, but I did ask him about her, and he said that he felt that her Bristol Trilogy novels were the best things she'd ever written, and recommended that I read them. But she didn't welcome the idea anyway of coming back to Bristol Polytechnic as it was then. Perhaps she didn't want to run into her ex-husband. Perhaps that was the reason.
There's a nice comment in the chat that somebody who's recently read Shadow Dance and can see a lot of Bristol in it, especially the decaying houses that are plundered, which I guess we've still got to this day, but it's all been gentrified in Clifton particularly. There's another question in the Q&A from Anne. I first discovered her work in the late 1970s and was struck by the similar density and detail in her work as I saw in the illustrations of Arthur Rackham, whose work was experiencing renewed popularity at that time. Is there any work on the relationship of Carter's writing with the visual arts, particularly in the folk and fairy tale idiom? So I can say that we know that Angela Carter was very aware of the arts, and particularly there was a programme that she made just before she died in 1991 called the Holy Family Album, in which she was imagining all of the photographs in God's photo album were actually representations of Christ in Western art history. And the reason that God's not in the picture is because he's behind the camera, because he's the dad. And it's a very controversial program that was aired, I think, in the lead up to Christmas, and it went to Ofcom, the equivalent of Ofcom at the time, and people found it very offensive. But her basic thesis was about seeing it as a reversed Oedipal idea, where God killed Mary because he was jealous of her relationship with the son. So very heretical. but it's full of amazing imagery from Western art history, which she very much researched, and she was wanting specific paintings to be included. And Marie drew on this in her curation of the Strange Worlds exhibition at the RWA, and she actually brought a number of the works that appear in that programme together in one of the galleries. Don't know if you can speak to that, Marie.
Yes, that was so exciting to be able to do that. Here's the catalogue, Strange Worlds, and I managed to get the Holman Hunt painting of the young Christ, and also they formed a sort of sequence actually, because there was one that related to the crucifixion, and the particular gallery managed to get them in. It was rather like a Gothic chapel, so it was very atmospheric, and managed to get some of the painters as well, such as Leonora Carrington, as Steve mentioned, some of the surrealist paintings. But it was really wonderful to be able to get those actual paintings. And I think that I hadn't appreciated the different sizes they were, because the Holman Hunt was a massive canvas, and then one of the others was really tiny. But we sort of put them together, and it was really a way of relating to that film. And it was through Charlotte's book. Charlotte's the only person that has really analysed the Holy Family album in a lot of detail, and that was really what inspired me to look at the film, and then to try and recreate the film, as it were, through the exhibition.
I'm just putting a link to that. Well, it's not a link, it's just it's Anagrams of Desire is the title of my book. That's about Angela Carter's writing for radio, film and television. So I write about that in the book. But it's actually John Ellis whose company Visions made that programme, and that's available on his website. And I'm not able to do that because I'm not on a laptop, but I don't know, Caleb, if you're still in the audience, maybe you could try and find a link and put the Holy Family album link in there. So there's lots of people saying really enjoyed it, finding out about history. Are we going to do a physical tour? Which we really do hope to do so at some point when it's safe to do so. It would take probably longer than 2 hours, and if the weather was like it is today, you're probably grateful that you're indoors. But I think Steve and Marie and I would like to, and we have had physical copies of the map printed, which when it's safe to do so, we will distribute at the Bristol Museum and the RWA and some of the venues that are on the walking tour. There's another thing in the chat here about Angela Carter being important to Bristol and to literature in Bristol. Why do you think it's taken so long for Bristol to recognise her as one of their own? Love the discussion about Angela Carter and the influence of music.
Yeah, can I just say that's from Sandy Fish and Jules, and Sandy was one of my students who studied Angela Carter with me a long time ago, and I think Sandy, we remembered when Angela Carter died, that I remember you saying we had a moment in our seminar to to remember her, and I think it's a very good question why it's taken so long. When the 25 years since her death came up, I wanted to commemorate it in some way, and with Charlotte and I, we're trying to do something, but there wasn't enough time, so we had to leave it for a little while afterwards, and then the exhibition happened, and I think that really kick-started a lot of interest, because there were so many events that grew up around it. We had a contemporary music concert, for example. We had musicians who composed music inspired by paintings, artworks in the exhibition. So there was a whole raft of workshops and creativity. It was school children coming and writing poems. They were pinned next to the artworks. And I think, and we also had a reading place where people could look at Angela Carter novels, and hopefully it did stimulate a greater interest in Carter and recognition of the importance the city's had for her work. And I also asked Zoe Brennan to give a talk at the Writing West conference that was organised by Professor Steve Poole at UWE as part of the Regional History Centre, and then I did a book called UWE Bristol, Writers in the City, which has Zoe's chapter in it. So I think we've been doing a lot, and Steve's been doing a lot, and Caleb and Charlotte, and we're all at UWE. So I think it's very appropriate that a lot of this has been coming from a Bristol-based university.
Right, am I still on camera? Can you still hear me?
No, you're an icon. You're an icon.
But you can hear me.
Yes,
I've done something on my phone and I don't know how to get myself back on. So
Yeah.
I can't look at the chat anymore. But I think there was yeah. So you take over, guys. I'll just listen and chip in.
I think if I've been thrown out, I don't think I can. Can you? I can't see anything anymore.
No, you're a frozen picture, Steve.
Oh, okay.
We can hear you.
Right. Okay. I can't. Everything is glazed over, and I can't really read the chat anymore either. So,
Something's
carry
happened to me. So I think maybe that's a cue for us to draw to an end and to say, I'd really like to say, I don't know if you can show your appreciation in the chat, which I can't see, but just say thank you to Steve. That was so illuminating, and I can't wait to be able to physically do the walking tour and join people in real life and experience that. And I just feel, I did feel very emotional by the end of your talk about, you know, what Angela Carter would have said about what's happening today and the legacy of Bristol. So thank you so much, Steve.
Let's do it. We'll do it as soon as we can.
Yeah. And can I just say that somebody in the chat tried to join the Angela Carter Society and they found the link wasn't working, but we will try and, I'm sure Charlotte will try and fix that, because
I think if you go to the, so that was on the Get Angela Carter site, which I'm not sure what's going on. So that's not the same as the Angela Carter Society.
Oh, okay.
Get Angela Carter is kind of where we put stuff that's happening just in Bristol, and it's the celebration of Angela Carter's association with Bristol. And the Angela Carter Society is an international society with a membership and a newsletter and so that's what you should join, because the Get Angela Carter is really just a repository for information about what we're doing in Bristol. It's not really something you subscribe to. So join the Angela Carter Society. The newsletter comes out in the summer. It's usually around July, depending on whether there's a global pandemic or not. It came out in September this year. But yeah, we're all so passionate about Angela Carter, and it's so lovely to have people in the audience that knew her, that are studying her, that are aware of her, and you know, continuing to celebrate her life and work. So thank you very much for joining us today. And yeah, I'm going to try and sort my computer out and go now. So thank you very much. And thank you to Steve, and thank you very much to Marie as well. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye.